All right, so for section 3, we're basically going to do the same thing we just did with demand, but now we're going to look at the supply side of markets and the supply side of our supply and demand model. So it's going to be very similar. There's only going to be a few slight differences, so pay attention. All right, so just like with demand, supply is a schedule or can be expressed as a curve on a graph as well, but it's just showing us the relationship between price. So just like before with demand, it's showing us a relationship between price, but this time it's the relationship between price and quantity supplied. Okay, so the quantity supplied and price, how are those two things related? That relationship is supply. Okay, and we still have our ceteris paribus assumption. So holding everything else constant or equal, the only thing is changing is price, and that's leading to changes in quantity demanded. Okay, now the quantity supplied, that's just the amount of a product or service that a firm is willing to sell at a given price. And so supply is the amount of a product or service that firms are willing to sell at all different prices, alternative prices. Pick a price, and if I have a supply curve or a supply schedule, and you tell me a price, I can tell you what the quantity supplied is at that price. Okay. And just like with demand, we have a law of supply. The only difference here is that the relationship is positive or direct. So the price and quantity supplied move in the same direction, not opposite directions like with the law of demand. Okay, so they move in the same direction. So as the price goes up, the quantity supplied goes up, holding everything else constant, right? Ceteris paribus, everything else equal. Okay, so it can be a little harder to relate to this to supply because most of us are not suppliers. Most of us are demanders. So it can be easier to relate to the law of demand. It makes sense for most students and is intuitive for most students. The law of supply can be a little bit harder to grasp intuitively, but the best way I've found to relate to it is to think of the one thing that most of us will or do supply, and that is labor. So think about this. What would your boss have to do in order to motivate you to supply more labor? In other words, what would your boss have to do to make you work overtime, for example, or just more hours in a week? What would they have to do? And what is price here? Price is the wage that you earn, right? So wage is the price of labor. So still a price. So what would they have to do to your price of labor? What would they have to do with your wage to motivate you to work more? Now, hopefully after thinking about it for a second, you thought, well, they'd have to pay me more, right? So that's the idea behind the law of supply. In order to motivate firms to supply a higher quantity of goods, they have to receive a higher price. Okay, so that's the intuition there. They have to be motivated by being able to sell at a higher price in order to get them to supply a larger quantity supplied, right? So that's the law of supply. And since it's a positive or direct relationship, it basically means that our supply curves will have a positive slope. All right, so just like with demand, we can have a supply schedule, which is a table that relates prices to quantities supplied at each price. And we can also convey the same information in a graph with a supply curve, with a line or a curve. And so, like I said, because of the law of supply, there's a positive or direct relationship between price and quantity supplied. And so that basically equates to a positively sloped line or curve, showing that there's a direct relationship between price and quantity supplied, of course, holding all else equal. So here's an example of a supply schedule, right? A table. And take a second to look at this and verify that there is indeed a direct or positive relationship between price and quantity supplied. Sure enough, as price goes down, quantity supplied goes down. So they move in the same direction, right? There's our direct relationship. Okay, so there's a schedule. We can also convey the same information with a curve or a graph. So here's a supply curve. Looks a little wobbly or wiggly, but and nevertheless, it's upward sloping, so there's a positive relationship. That's our law of supply in action. So there you go. There's a supply curve. And then just like with demand, we can talk about individual supply curves and market supply curves. The individuals here are not consumers or buyers, but in this case, suppliers or sellers or businesses, firms. They are the individual suppliers. And so we can talk about, for example, supplier number one's supply schedule in this case, which is in column 2, or supplier number two's quantity supplied schedule, their supply schedule, so that's column 3. And then if those are the only 2 firms in the market, we can just add those quantities together to get to the market supply curve, right? Which is what is in column 4. So very similar to what we've seen already with demand. Okay, and graphically looks pretty similar. You'll see panel B is the individual supply curve for firm 1. Panel C is the individual supply curve for firm 2. And if we add those together horizontally, moving across, we get the market supply curve as shown in panel D. And again, you can see that the market supply is it looks like it's pushed to the right. Okay, and that's because when supply increases or is higher, it moves to the right. Okay, so that's why it's further to the right than either of the individual ones, because market supply is higher than either individual supply curve. Okay, so there you go. All right, and then here's the ultimate market supply schedule. Okay, so take note here that the quantity is in millions of units, so that 10 at $5 is 10 million units, and 8 million units, and 6 million units, and so on. So this is the market supply schedule, and here's what it looks like as a curve on a graph. So pretty straightforward, hopefully, for you. Very similar to demand. Really, the only difference is we now have a direct relationship instead of an inverse or negative relationship. Okay, so that was section 3. I'll see you in the next video for section 4 of chapter 3.